Hello there, pushers. Welcome to another session of Notes. Today we will be tackling Chapter 33, Franklin Roosevelt's Foreign Policy during the Great Depression and leading into World War II. In this session, we'll be looking at the direction Franklin Roosevelt wanted to take our nation in foreign policy during the Great Depression, and then also look at the staunch American neutrality that was taking place between 1933 and 1940 as we enter the prelude of World War II. To begin, I just want to say that Roosevelt's early foreign policy was subordinate to his strategy for rehabilitating the American economy. Roosevelt's policies would attempt to distance America from its world power status and its responsibilities. For example, Roosevelt's going to reject the international plan to stabilize global currencies at the London Economic Conference. That's the first thing we'll talk about. Next, he will grant independence to the Philippines through the Tidy-McDuffie Act of 1934, and he will shrug off Teddy Roosevelt's corollary through the institution of his good neighbor policy. Then we'll look at how Roosevelt would also seek to expand a freer trade and in the process grant diplomatic recognition to the new Soviet government of the USSR. So in his first term, Roosevelt was incredibly reluctant. In fact, he was resistant to this idea of sacrificing America's domestic recovery from the Great Depression for the sake of international cooperation or some kind of globalism that would tie American interests to the interests of the rest of the world. In 1933, world leaders had organized an economic summit in London. And originally, Roosevelt had planned to send a delegate. In fact, his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, who was a widely respected diplomat, was going to go to this summit and be a part of that. But the chief objective of the London summit became stabilizing global currencies, basically coming to a mutual agreement on the value of currencies and really not being able to let the market influence what the value of a currency was, and so giving it kind of an artificial value. And Roosevelt felt like that would really set American interests behind that of the world's, and so he ultimately backs out of the London Economic Conference. He wants to continue pursuing his inflationary policies of buying back gold, and was worried that because of American policies that had replaced the repayment of American debts to foreign nations using gold, that American plans would have to be set aside. So Roosevelt backs out of the London Economic Conference. And if you're wondering what the value of this particular piece of history is it really just demonstrates how America continues to pursue isolationist policies. Another example of America's withdrawal from the world is our withdrawal from Asia. Congress, very ardently isolationist as well, drafts the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934, which would provide the independence of the Philippines after a 12-year period of economic and political tutoring, so to speak, helping the Philippines set up their own government and become economically independent. Now, America is saying that this was independence for the Philippines, but really American isolationists were feeling like this would be independence from the Philippines, in the sense that they had become an expensive liability in protecting them, especially as Japan militarizes and expands its nationalistic policy into China and other Asian countries. The organized labor force of the United States was frustrated with Filipino labor. Of course, they did not want the Filipinos to be protected by labor laws because that would send job opportunities in manufacturing to the Philippines. And as we talked about previously, nativist attitudes were that the Filipinos were not truly American. And this was especially felt in industries like sugar plantations. And the competition there in agricultural goods led to legislative pressure to abandon this experiment in having an American empire in Southeast Asia. So the United States backs out over the course of 12 years, and by 1946, the Philippines become an independent country. Now, the United States still has a military presence there, specifically naval presence in the Philippines, and that's going to be challenged in the naval battles between the United States and Japan through World War II, and we will get to that at a later time. I'm sure the policies of Franklin Roosevelt had former President William McKinley rolling over in his grave, because the maintenance and protection of the American empire that McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt had helped to build was quickly dispatched by the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration. Here's the third example of that. Because of the cost and relatively low return in policing Latin America through the Roosevelt corollary, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt felt it was in the country's best interest to walk away from that role as police, as the law enforcement of Latin America. And so he institutes, in juxtaposition to Roosevelt's what became known as bad neighbor policy, he institutes good neighbor policy. And what that looks like is that the United States announces its giving up its ambition to use armed intervention in Latin America. And we've seen how the United States had gone into places like Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, in order to stabilize those governments. Later, we have President Taft with his dollar diplomacy and trying to save those countries in order to protect American interests in the Western Hemisphere. By the time we get to the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is walking away from that. And so the last of the U.S. Marine Corps exits Haiti in 1934. The United States withdraws the Platt Amendment as well when a military strongman by the name of Fulgencio Batista comes to power in Cuba. And while Latin America at first really applauds this, in fact, there's very few American presidents that have had the popularity as FDR had in Latin America, we can ask whether or not in the long run, this was what was best for the stability, at least the political stability, of countries like Haiti, Cuba, Dominican Republic, and so on. Reducing our investments in foreign countries in Latin America is only the first part of Roosevelt's Great Depression foreign policy. The second part is to roll back these cumbersome tariffs that had been imposed by the three Republican presidents that preceded him. If you recall, Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover had all increased tariffs on foreign countries in order to protect American wealth and business at a time of great prosperity during the 1920s. Well, that kind of protectionism led to a trade war, led to higher tariffs globally. And so when FDR comes into office, he uses the Hawley-Smoot tariff provision to reduce the national tariff by 50%. And keep in mind, he does not need the approval of Congress, and he avoids the protests of lobbyists because the provisions of that law allowed the President of the United States to increase or decrease the tariff by as much as 50%. So he rolls back American tariffs by 50%, and his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, quickly negotiates 21 different trade agreements with various countries by the end of 1939. And really, this reversal in the high protective tariff policy paves the way for a free trade international economic system that is going to shape America as an industrial power after World War II. And so this is one of those kind of under-recognized accomplishments of FDR that led towards a recovery from the Great Depression outside of the New Deal. It's also important to note that this trade policy also becomes an important diplomatic policy, that improving economic relationships between the United States and other countries, specifically countries in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America, helps Roosevelt prepare to take on the menace of Germany and Japan. Roosevelt really hopes that should the Monroe Doctrine be tested, that Latin America will help defend the Western Hemisphere from the encroachment of those fascist regimes. Speaking of totalitarian regimes, another milestone in Roosevelt's foreign policies during the days of the Great Depression is to extend diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union. Now, this is contrary to American principles of capitalism and democracy, but really what Roosevelt was doing here by acknowledging the Soviet Union as the rightful government of Russia and Eastern European countries that it now controlled, was that he was making an economic move by opening trade up between the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as a diplomatic move. As Hitler and Mussolini are rising to power in Europe, and as Japan seems to be taking over a greater amount of influence in Asia, the Soviet Union is undeniably the largest military and economic power that has a tremendous ability to influence the economics and outcome of any kind of future after the Great Depression. So that's pretty much it as far as foreign policy issues that we need to talk about that were taking place in the first term of Roosevelt's administration that are separate from World War II. In this second part of this lecture, we are going to look kind of step by step at the prelude to World War II and how American isolationism really is the standard by which Roosevelt tries to keep the country up through the fall of France in 1940. Now, most of you are familiar with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, and you should also be familiar with the fascists of Italy and the military dictatorship that sort of evolves in Japan as well. In this particular lecture, I'm going to be focusing mostly on America's response to this fanatic who found a way to control Germany by 1933. And really, the one element that Hitler makes a name for himself through is by attacking the Treaty of Versailles and pointing out how Germany had been betrayed by a range of outside influences in the negotiations of the Treaty of Versailles in the era of the Great Depression, and that these that these enemies of the German state really needed to be rooted out, that he, as this charismatic leader with a plan for reform, was the only person capable of getting Germany out of its desperate position, resonated with a nation that couldn't afford a loaf of bread, whose economy and currency were in complete shambles. And so the world watches as Hitler rises to power, at first secretly and illegally rearming the German state and putting people back to work, rearming the German state, and building what he calls his Third Reich. By 1936, Hitler and Mussolini had allied themselves in the Rome-Berlin Axis, or what we abbreviate to be the Axis powers. And through propaganda and militarization, create these fascist regimes that are really unparalleled in world history. So here we have a picture of Hitler reviewing his troops. These theatrical displays of pomp and ceremony were part of what restored the German people's pride and hope for their future. It's also what led Hitler to be one of the most infamous dictators in world history. International gangsterism was also spreading in the Far East. Imperial Japan, like Germany and Italy, also resented the Treaty of Versailles and felt that they had been forgotten in the final outcome and the division of power, and really had been betrayed in the Treaty of Versailles, since they weren't part of the superior white race, and the Japanese had a lot of hostility towards Western powers because of that. In response to it, they began a nationalistic campaign to build their navy and to expand the territory around Japan for living space, for expanding like an empire. And eventually they reject the tenets of the Treaty of Versailles. They eliminate military treaties they had forged with the United States, which had been a good trade partner to that point. And they eventually, by 1940, have joined the Axis in what becomes known as the Tripartite Pact, which brings Germany, Italy, and Japan into a military alliance. The United States responds to these dictatorships, these totalitarian regimes, with isolationism. In fact, the biggest concern for Americans in the early 30s is that they aren't, and I use this term as a quote, bamboozled into another world war, into getting wrapped up into European affairs, and particularly becoming the creditor to belligerents that may or may not repay their debts. And so we see acts of isolationism in response to the prelude of World War II right away. For example, in 1934, Congress, leery of giving debts or credit out to a nation that may not repay its debts, passes the Johnson Debt Default Act, which basically prevents the United States from lending money to any country that had defaulted in its loans following World War I. And so, should an ally be attacked and be in need of assistance, the Johnson Debt Default Act basically tells that nation that it's going to simmer in its own juices, because the United States won't be held responsible for their security or for their success. So, isolation runs so deeply in American culture in the 30s that there are calls for a constitutional amendment to forbid the declaration of war by Congress, except in the instances of an invasion on US soil. There's this sense that the United States is insulated by the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, and that we would not be drawn into a war by outside forces. As we get into the middle 30s, Roosevelt and Congress abandoned the traditional policy of freedom of the seas, which you may recall was an essential objective for the Spanish-American War, as well as World War I. That was that McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt had really championed during their administrations, was America's access to markets and naval access on the high seas. And then as we get into World War I, Wilson makes freedom of the seas one of his essential 14 points. But the isolationist Congress and Franklin Roosevelt are quick to pass neutrality acts, and they do that in 3 years in succession, stipulating that if and when the President of the United States identifies or proclaims the existence of a foreign war, that the United States and its citizens are immediately barred from sailing on a ship of either of the belligerent sides. They are prohibited from selling or transporting any kind of munitions, so weapons or ammunition, to either belligerent side, and that the United States and its banks are prohibited from making loans to warring countries. It doesn't matter if they're allies or enemies, friends or foes under these neutrality acts are supposed to be treated the same. Now, we're going to talk about the Neutrality Act of 1937 a little bit more in depth here in a moment, but it's important to recognize on face value, there is no distinguishing between enemy and ally. So these neutrality acts were obviously tailored to prevent the United States from falling into a conflict like World War I. If you recall, U.S. merchant ships were attacked by the German U-boats. We had passengers on British passenger lines like the Lusitania that had been attacked, and merchants were also involved in clandestinely sending munitions and loans to our allies. And ultimately that draws the United States into World War I. These laws were created as a way to try to safeguard our country from repeating that same experience. We're going to call that storm cellar neutrality, because people are, in a tornado, go down into a storm cellar and wait it out. But this storm cellar neutrality is tragically short-sighted. First of all, it assumes that we get to choose peace or war, and that we are protected from being attacked so long as we don't attack others, which Pearl Harbor is going to prove is false. We become a prisoner of our own fears. The United States fails to recognize that it has tremendous amount of power and the ability to influence the course of World War II for the better almost immediately. Instead, we get into a situation where bloodshed is prolonged. And it's also a matter of dubious morality. This idea that it doesn't matter what these dictators are doing, whether you're talking about the persecution and Holocaust of Jewish people, or whether you're talking about the military violence that's being committed in China by the Japanese, that is none of America's concern is clearly a immoral kind of standard, but the United States was too fragile or too insecure in its position after the Great Depression to worry about those kinds of moralistic issues. Instead, the war will be prolonged, and totalitarian foes are going to be emboldened by the lack of action and appeasement that the United States and other countries are going to offer it. And the first example we see of that is in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, where Spain had a republican system of government, and it was thrown down by a military dictatorship that pretty much became a puppet government of the Nazi regime in Germany. There were some Americans that rose up to fight for democracy and to do what they felt was the moral, ethical, responsible thing in protection of democracy and liberalism. 3,000 people joined what was called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade to go and fight and volunteer in the Spanish Civil War in between 1936 and 1939. But for the vast majority of Americans, they remained hidden behind an isolationist attitude. Japan tested our commitment to isolation earlier than Pearl Harbor. In 1937, Japan launched an all-out invasion into China. At one point, it bombed and sank an American gunboat, the Panay. Now, the casualties on the Panay were relatively minor, but if you think about what triggered the conflict between the United States and Spain during the Spanish-American War, the Maine, right? Remember the Maine? This would have, a generation before, launched us into the war. But instead, America accepts Japan's apologies and its indemnity money and turns a blind eye to this flagrant act of aggression. Simultaneously, Roosevelt does not recognize the conflict between Japan and China as an official war. Now, there is some ethical reasoning in that. Had the United States recognized Japan's invasion into China as an act of war, the United States would have been obligated under its neutrality acts to stop supplying China with munitions. Now, the reverse side of the coin is Japan was buying a tremendous amount of munitions from the United States as well. So we go on allowing both sides to purchase weapons. But if the United States had turned the faucet off, China would have been entirely unarmed. In Europe, Hitler grew bolder. By 1935, he was flouting the Treaty of Versailles by requiring military service by all men in Germany. And he also took his new mechanized military into the Rhineland, this neutral zone between France and Germany that had, under the stipulations of Treaty of Versailles, been a demilitarized area for Germany. The Rhineland represents a major manufacturing district and transportation district on the Rhine River for Germany, and it's been an area of dispute between the Germans and the French before, considering its value. After the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was not allowed to protect this area with its own military. And so in 1935, Hitler, using tanks that were built illegally under his economic recovery plan, uses that military moves it into the Rhineland, brazenly defying international law. The United States, again, reflects isolationism. But at this time, I want to talk a little bit about how Roosevelt begins seeing his responsibility as president not as sole defender of public opinion, but to make decisions that are right, regardless of what public opinion is. Moving into 1937, Roosevelt gives a speech called the Quarantine Speech. And really, what the Quarantine Speech is about is encouraging the United States or encouraging people to support positive endeavors, meaning proactive measures to quarantine or cut off aggressive nations. Now, what Roosevelt was probably talking about was using economic measures to stop belligerent nations from gaining more territory, whether that is cutting off oil supplies to Italy so that it can't continue its progress in North Africa, or whether it is to apply sanctions on Germany as they continue to violate the Treaty of Versailles, but not necessarily using military force. The problem is, though, is that isolationists view economic force as a prelude to military force, and the United States is absolutely opposed to anything that would move in that direction. Instead, we become part of the movement amongst our allies to appease these dictatorships. Appeasement, of course, means give them what they want and hope that they behave themselves. So here are some examples of important moments of appeasement in the mid to late 1930s. Beginning in March 1938, Hitler marches his military uncontested into Austria. And the people of Austria, in some respects, seeing what has happened in Germany, more or less welcome it. Now, that is one thing, but what is really quite surprising is now we have an act of one country conquering another. We've seen Hitler defy the Treaty of Versailles over and over and over, and yet nobody does anything about this. And so each time Hitler defies the Treaty of Versailles, it has an impact on the authority and effectiveness of the League of Nations. Hitler's defiance and appeasement is ultimately going to destroy the League of Nations. After World War II, we will see the United Nations, which the United States becomes a part of, rise in its ashes, okay? But as in the words of the Prime Minister of England at the time, a guy by the name of Neville Chamberlain, he says, "Let there be peace in our time." And what he's really saying is, hopefully allowing Hitler to do what he wants to do will lead to peace. It doesn't. In the late summer of 1938, guys like Chamberlain, FDR, the leaders of Europe come together with Adolf Hitler in Munich, Germany, at the Munich Conference, and they try to hammer out what will be a negotiated deal to get Hitler to stop his policy of expansion, Lebensraum, or living space. And what Hitler asks for is the Sudetenland, which is a manufacturing center that butts up against the southern neighbor of, today it's the Czech Republic. At the time, it was Czechoslovakia. And so he basically tells international leaders that this is the last step in his plan to expand Germany's traditional territory. And the leaders at the Munich conference say, okay, as long as you don't touch the rest of Czechoslovakia. Well, 6 months later, March 1939, Hitler conquers the rest of Czechoslovakia very quickly. In August of that year, he enters into a pact with Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. The world holds its breath because we have the two most aggressive militaries coming together in this moment. And really, what Stalin had hoped was that a German-Russian agreement would lead to their mutual ability to bring down Western powers like Britain and France. What the nature of their pact is that Hitler will invade the western portion of Poland. Poland had been shaped out of World War I. It was one of the things that comes out of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler will take control of the western part of Poland. Stalin will take the eastern part, and they will mutually agree not to harm one another as they both work to expand over their traditional territories. Fine. We will talk about why then the Soviet Union ultimately joins the Allied powers in fighting Hitler at a later time. But for now, in 1939, they are tentative allies as they take control of Poland and as they thumb their noses at the rest of Europe. When Germany invades Poland, it's the last straw, it's the last violation of the Treaty of Versailles that these two powers will stomach. So when Germany invades Poland, Britain and France declare war on Germany. The Soviet Union stays neutral, and it's pretty much widely recognized now that appeasement has been utter failure. The United States was anti-Nazi from the beginning, anti-Hitler, anti-Nazi, fervently supportive of democracies, despite the fact that we were isolationist. We kind of had this romantic idea that right will always triumph over evil. And so our involvement is really inconsequential because good will triumph over evil. Roosevelt, though, knows that this requires action. Britain and France urgently need American planes and weapons in order to address this new threat because very quickly, Germany's going to turn around and invade the Netherlands and Belgium and push on into France. So 1937, Roosevelt takes one step towards militarizing or involving the United States in Europe's affairs. Now, he issues a Neutrality Act, the Neutrality Act of 1939. But unlike the three previous Neutrality Acts, this one is going to allow nations to buy weapons from the United States, weapons and war material from the United States on a cash and carry basis. Now, what that means is that nations can buy weapons from us, but we will not lend them anything. We will not issue credit. They have to have the cash on hand to purchase the weapons, and then we will not bring those weapons to them. Because thinking about back to World War I, where German U-boats were blowing merchant ships out of the water, if you want to buy weapons from the United States, you need to haul your boats over here. You need to put those weapons on your own boats and sail them back to the war zone. The United States isn't going to get involved in transporting weapons, and we're not going to get involved in picking who we'll trade with. Now, that sounds like, well, why didn't Germany buy weapons from the United States? Why doesn't Japan buy weapons from the United States. Well, Japan is buying weapons from the United States, but Germany is reined in, their Navy is reined in by the British Navy. So really, our Neutrality Act of 1939 shows preference to European democracies that have superior naval power over the belligerent Axis powers. Okay, so to summarize, what we've talked about here is American foreign policy through the Great Depression and how that policy really took a backseat to economic recovery. The foreign policy Roosevelt engages in his first term really focuses on trying to give up or reduce the number of responsibilities America has as a world power in exchange for an isolationist standpoint. In doing that, we back out of the London Economic Conference. We give independence to the Philippines, and we establish good neighbor policy in Latin America. Additionally, we try to reduce the economic blockades that had been put up during the Roaring '20s, to reduce the tariffs, to open free trade up in Latin America and in Europe as a way of stimulating economic growth. We also diplomatically recognize the Soviet Union in hopes that they will be a good trade partner and a potential military ally, as totalitarian regimes seem to be sprouting up in both the Pacific as well as in the Old World. Then we looked at American foreign policy specific to the prelude of World War II, how isolationism was the policy of the United States between 1933 and 1939, that we really took great measures to avoid war. We would at least not discern between friend and foe until after the fall of Poland, and that in 1939 then we took our first big step towards picking sides with the cash and carry policies that allowed countries to purchase weapons from the United States on a cash and carry basis, meaning they had to pay for them up front. We weren't going to lend money or lend weapons, and we certainly weren't going to transport them, because Americans to that point still remembered World War I as kind of a grand waste of time. In our next lecture, we'll talk about U.S. policy as it changes in the 1940s. The need for more weapons by our allies as they fight Hitler and Mussolini, and of course the event that changes everything, the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941.